Sudhakar sir?
Yes, so very good afternoon to all of you. I hope I'm audible and you can see me.
Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I would like to thank the college and the management, the authorities, the principal, and all the other management, the teaching fraternities as well for this opportunity, especially the head of the department, Dr. R. Rashila, and her team, the organizing secretary, Dr. Bhuvana. Of course, back-to-back sessions, having back-to-back sessions, that too in a week's time, it is not an easy thing, and I'm pretty sure that the department is organizing it very well. A special appreciation to the organizing secretary for all the efforts that she has taken. She has been beautifully, mediating between all of us, and it is very precise and a very perfect, organized way of having a session. So thank you all. Thank you for the opportunity. And I should acknowledge the convener, former professor and head of the Department of Linguistics, Bharatiya University. My master, sir, has Muthukrishnan sir. He has taught me copy editing papers back those days during my post graduation. I still remember all those memories, and he is a person who had influenced me at every juncture of my academic journey. And I extend my gratitude to sir. I also would like to acknowledge the presence of my mentor guide, of course, my godfather by all means, who is the head and associate professor of our department, Dr. P. Nagaraj. Needless to talk about him, even now the participants were discussing about the session, the morning session. The rigor, the rage, and the spirit of an academician. You could see it all today morning, and he had guided me at every stage of my journey, academic journey, and the freedom that he has given to be an independent thinker. Even today, when I'm dealing with this topic, thinking in literature, I remember the days where he actually allowed. Uh, he never kept any restriction to extend the thoughts even beyond the text and the resources. So it is because of the support that sir has delivered me throughout the journey that I'm here today. And I would also like to acknowledge yesterday's chief guest. Sir is not here in absentia, Professor Dr. Raju. He had given a wonderful beginning to the program. And all the prior speakers, I was here listening to Dr. Shwati, my good friend, and Rosaline ma'am. So I'm glad that this is going really good, and especially all the participants were very receptive and interactive. Uh, yes, I'm a little ambitious today because an afternoon during a pandemic, a lockdown, a weekend, above all, a weekend when you're giving me your time, I think I should deliver something solid. And I have 20 plus slides, but because we are right away heading to the valediction, I'll try to wrap it up. As you all know, the title is Critics Beyond Art Thinking in Literature. And if you try to decode the title, let me start with the term critic. As we all know, the word meaning of critic, it is an appraisal, right? It is it is the product of criticism, an essay, an evaluation report. Criticism is the process of assessment, and critic is the outcome of criticism. Criticism is where we have to be very analytical, very judgmental, but critic is a word which is more constructive, which is very impersonal, and it is of course unbiased. Unlike criticism, critic is a more constructive term. Criticism is, of course, I don't. We all always have this tendency towards criticism as judgment, right? We have that negative connotation always attributed to criticism, but criticism could also be vague and destructive. But when it comes to critic, where we can always attain a balance. So appreciating a text is effortless. We all read, we all experience the text, experience the reading. But in order to draw a balanced analysis, a critical analysis, one has to invest deliberate time and efforts. I would say that critics and criticism is a reassurance that somebody is actually reading your work or somebody is analyzing you, assessing you, and it is a way of reassurance that we are, attended. So now the question is, can we really think amidst all this? Between the criticism and the critics, what is the space of thinking? The answer is yes, we can think. We are thinkers. Basically, more than anything, we are thinkers. And if we want to construct meaningful critics and discourses, more than anything, we have to indulge in the process of thinking. And we know this discipline, literature, is widely and the interdisciplinary extensions. So with all, only when the reader is approaching a text. So today, anything and everything in the world, I would say, has a literary rigor. Everything. Even during this pandemic, today morning, you have listened to my master, how he was talking about languaging, where every alternative of life has changed. And it has a definite influence of language. From the daydreaming to the conversations that we derive, to the movies we watch, to the text messages that we send, the smartphones, the gadgets, everything, where though we have a lot of technological replacements today, we have a gadget, which had changed, made a lot of transformation into the world. One thing that still exists, irreplaceable, is the language, the embodiment of language. Maybe that we have a better and sophisticated ways and tools of discussion. Of course, we do have, but language always exists. It has a beautiful way of accommodating people, accommodating everything, the thoughts of the people, the ideas of the people. Though, it is only, I used to tell my students, though it is only 26 alphabets and a handful of punctuation, after all a script, right, which is a very tiny entity. With some subsystem and system, it is beautiful to think how much of abstractions this language is accommodating from the human minds, right? Whatever we think, a language which is just having 26 alphabets could accommodate our emotions, what we feel, how beautifully it is encapsulating everything. So when we think that way, we can undoubtedly acknowledge that language is the greatest blessing or the discovery the human civilization had ever encountered. Everything is found before, after, but language is still significant. And I don't know how many of you have gone through this book, Sapiens, by Yuval Noah Harari, where he traces the history of humankind. He addresses man as myth makers. It is interesting where he says how much of subjectivity that we have to deal with in our everyday encounters. From the fiction to fact, everything, right? He discusses everything there and he speculatively interprets the cognitive revolution, agricultural revolution, and the scientific revolution. These are the major ideas that he discusses in the book, the three major revolutions. And of everything he says, of all these changes, language dominates the world. According to him, the order of the world, to everything that we have created, from religion, liberalism, capitalism, every school of thought, every possibilities that have created, is a semantic exercise. Many things have changed, yet language dominates the world. From all the parallel thinking, every alternatives, we create everything through language. So he says that, it is beautiful at a point where he says, Albert Einstein has a parrot who imitates him, who mimics his gestures, who mimics his yellings, who mimics his sound. Every vocal activity that he does, the parrot who imitates the Einstein, but only language can be mimicked. Language can be imitated. Intentions cannot be. He can imitate Einstein. He can imitate what he speaks. But the parrot really cannot imitate or replicate the intentions or the thought process of the speaker. So this is where, or how he feel about the parrot, right? The parrot can imitate him, but he really cannot imitate the way Albert Einstein feels about what he speaks. So here is where we have to assert on the power of mind, the language, literature we read. Once the language shapes the mind, I used to tell my students, once the language shapes the mind will rule the language. The mind will rule our thoughts. So the interchange of thought and language is a beautiful process, and we encounter it throughout our literary readings and interpretations. It is not an easy thing. Sometimes it tucks, it overlaps between the thoughts and the interpretations. We fumble, but somehow we make it all intact. And the play of language of over this human subjectivity, the reading of literature, interpretation of the meanings, the science of doing everything. This is what I would like to present today. This is going to be the schema of my discussion. Moving to the next slide. Yes. So let us ponder over this term, cognition. We know that cognition means thinking, and thinking means intentions. And intentions means, of course, language. A mind that is so silent, right? We have a mind which is very invisible. We do not know whether mind really exists. What is that entity or the faculty that functions in our system when we think? But you know that, we have a conscious which is very conditioned, which is very habitualized, which is very active, which is very awake. But in spite of all the training that we have given to our conscious, this happens in the wink of an eye. If you hear a sound now, right now, or if you experience an unexpected smell, or the breeze, the rain, a song which we hear from the neighbor's house. I think, all of you would have experienced that moment where you listen to your favorite music out of nowhere, from a grocery shop, a supermarket, or from a neighbor's playlist. So my point is, everything, all the stimuli, even the merest indication of a stimuli, how well we respond to it. It alerts us. It reminds us the things of the past, the memories. It induces our thoughts. So if our mind could respond to all these things, how much it will respond to the art and literature and all these books and the movies we watch. So I'm just trying to assert the power of the mind, which is very conditioned, but it is responsive. It is responsive to the art and the literature we are exposed to. So in all these illustrations which I've given you, the senses are so adapted. We are trained to do our everyday things. We are conscious, we are awake, we are conditioned. Yet a small trigger, a change, it changes everything, right? Our capability to imagine and reflect cannot be undermined. So in that way, I want to say that literature is the richest artifact which has an immediate power to inverse our thinking. It can change the way we think. Everything that we do can be altered by the books we read. It gives local habitualization, unexpected thinking, unexpected feelings. It makes strange things familiar. It makes familiar things strange. It can alter our routines, right? From our routines to food habits to everything that we do could easily be altered with literature, the books we read. So it can definitely change the way we think. And let me talk a little about the conversations. I am sure all of you know this. We all have people with whom we can talk or we can communicate. We can have this language exchange. So you think about all these conversations, the language exchange. We use the same instrument, right? The speaker and the listener use the same instrument, language, the skills to read one another's mind. This is called the mirror effect of conversations, where right now I'm talking and you're all capturing my thoughts, not only the words, but my intentions, what I really wanted to express. You are anticipating what may come, the sensory motor awareness, where, because it is an offline session, online session, you cannot look into my gestures or body language or the eye movements. But had it been an offline session and had we had a face-to-face interaction, you would have definitely looked and acquired my intentions through all that. So we can decipher all these things in the communication, what somebody wants to communicate and predict. We can also predict what the person is going to talk. It needs a constant anticipation of what may come, what is spoken and what is unspoken. This is also could be inferred, right? Sometimes we will have to listen to what is not spoken more than what is spoken. So there are some people with whom we can communicate, and there are also other people where our language fails. Articulate is not needed. Because I used to say that, more than language, more than the words, language is the vibes. When some people, they get into the room, I actually, muse this. Some people, when they get into the room, you get their intentions. They don't even have to talk. They don't even have to utter a single word. But when some people come to you, like when they approach you, you get the vibes. You know what they feel. So language is an element of expression, but it's also an element of deception. I can say something and I cannot mean it. If we trace back to all the great tragedies that we have read, all the greatest downfalls of the empires and the great rulers, it is all by the deception of language, the duality of language to express something and mean something else. It can deceive beautifully. It can express and it can deceive beautifully. Deception is, this is something to be seriously looked at. Today morning, we had a discussion on this, the duality of language, languaging. Just by listening to session, we don't understand a text. Even in the close listening of the lecture, as I already said, sometimes you will not be able to infer what I really mean. Your reflections may be entirely different from my intentions or my objectives of this session. So maybe that is why we definitely need to have an anthropological perspective where literature is collective. I used to say companionship is so important in literature. The people with whom you read books, where you can talk about books. The solitary writings, of course, all these literatures are the muse. It is not a collective entity. It is produced in isolation. The solitary writings and the muse that turn into the subject, right? All these shared meanings and the common readings. So I'm just trying to say that language happens in isolation, but it is also a social practice. All the physical properties and the sensory motor characteristics, which I've mentioned here, this could be applied to our everyday things, to our language and literature. And there is a way by which we infer the meanings from the physical to the molecular to the aesthetic, right? Even our body has to function according to the language that we decipher. So there is a way by which the mind, body have to together be in sync and indulge in the process of this meaning making. Moving ahead to the next slide. Yes. I have this question. Why do we still read all these books? The books written in another time, which is in the past, another age, another time zone, which is very ancient, right? We have desolated it, and yet we come back to it, we go back to it. Originally, it is creative, but it is very old. Why do we still read them? Even after ages it is written, we hunt and we pull them down from the libraries, from the bookstalls. Our because when you read a certain set of books, you will understand what our mind is, right? Changing presence of the mind could be very well felt by the books we read. As C.S. Lewis said, chief value of old literature lies in the identity, the way it helps us to look at ourselves. Because sometimes the books that we hated in the past years might become the favorite read today. So it helps us to understand ourselves in a way, the way we have undertaken a transition, the changes that has taken place in our own self. So it helps us to collect our past. Even the history cannot help us to get the past in the way the books can. So all these books have a way of helping us to understand our own mind, our own thinking, and very importantly, the freedom of will. All of us know the freedom of will, right? We discuss about it so much in Paradise Lost, in Milton's Paradise Lost. We can experience everything without the risk of really knowing it, only in literature. We learn how to deal with every mishap, every circumstance which has gone wrong, which has gone extraordinary. This is the practical way to make sense of the world, literature is. Because it doesn't tell us what to do and what not to do. It doesn't instruct us to do things in a particular way. No matter how brutally we interrogate all this text, It never harms us. It is not imposing you, read, interpret me in a particular way. It doesn't tell us that. It is not forcing us to believe things we don't want to believe. So the freedom of choice, the freedom of meaning making, that we experience everything in the dual and binary, right? We can experience all the paradoxes, all this juxtapositions and everything good and bad and evil, angelic, demonic, everything, from witches, wolves, angels, the urban, the castles, the palaces, places, people, everything can be experienced through the books we read. And by letting our minds pass through all these probabilities, which otherwise we cannot experience something happening in another country, another culture by staying. So otherwise all these perspectives, all these experiences would be a mere probability. So we realize we connotate, we derive patterns from our readings. By letting our minds pass through all these probabilities, I would say, we are consciously or unconsciously creating a lot of mental maps of people, places, and we make decisions about them. We will realize between wicked and the wise. The good age, all the good and bad, everything would not have been experienced by us had we not got a space of literature. So as much as it gives us knowledge and wisdom, it expresses our thinking, it expands our thinking. It gives the space of the mind where we can think. And I would say that, cognition, it is critically inflicted. When you're thinking, you cannot be, you cannot be free. You cannot be free, right? We will have to decide upon things when you think. We cannot let our mind just fly and flutter, and we cannot be so emotional when we read or when we think. We, of course, we can be, but there is a point where we will have to shun away from our emotions and move on with the rationality, with the logic. So we have to decide between the actual and the textual at a point of time, the fact and the fiction, the real insanity that is read, that is experienced, and the insanity portrayed in the text. So today we need to be more analytical than anything, and it cannot happen without experiencing both, without experiencing the binary. So in order to read, write, and do all the other language activity, one needs to be critical and at the same time creative. So I would say that, we need to find an intersection where one can be critical and one can be creative. And, the culturally we have evolved because we are all thinkers. Basically, we are all thinkers and we have the clarity of language. So the way we read and reciprocate from all the verbs and rhymes and all the literary components that we decode, literature is a product of human cognition. Literature, of course, it is a way of discovering our own creative and critical thinking. And it is deeply rooted in the physical, because it is also said that, the words, the language we use has a biological source. It has a biological space inside the body. So we have to remember that, human cognition is a process which is very entangled, which is intertwined. Moving ahead, next slide. So today, neurosciences have a lot of advancements, and it is an emerging interdisciplinary area, right? Where all the linguists, psychologists, the neurologists, they are all coming together and they are trying to decode the brain function and the language. So the cognitive characteristics of language are deeply discussed. And today we have a lot of scanning techniques, advancements that has taken place in the cognitive science. Even there are thinking laboratories in IITs and some of the central universities. I happen to read that they have come out with the laboratories of experimenting thinking. The cognitive psychologists are conducting experiments to understand the thinking patterns and the imaginative qualities of the people. They call it as the thought experiments. And they are capturing the mental processes during the language use, what we really think. So I've already told you this cross-disciplinary extensions. Language is not only a tool of communication. It is not just a communicative medium. It is not only the speech, but it is the intention before the words, we utter. It is also the intention before the speech. So as a cognitive instrument, it is a cognitive instrument. We have to look at new ways of thinking about language and literature, especially even yesterday you had a discussion on the higher order rational thinking by beautiful session by Rosalind ma'am. And understanding the perception and the effect of the mind-body duality. This is one of the most complex discussion in psychology and cognitive science, the mind-body, the binary, where we have a mind which is very fluid, which is very, dynamic, a body which is very predictable, and a mind which is very unpredictable. We do not know how our mind is going to function for or what we are going to think for the next 15 minutes, but we know how our body will function. So the mind-body duality is the working principle of the psychology, and this have an influence on language because, as yesterday Muthukrishnan sir pointed out, language is in a state of flux. It is not static. It keeps changing, right? We are reading the books from the past, but we have moved on. A lot of things around us have changed. And when we read the same books 100 years or 10 years after 10 years, the meaning making will be entirely different. So I just want to reiterate that forever, literature is enduring instrument of the human thought. It is human. It is a medium of the human thought more than language. And it is counterfactual, of course. A lot of people have come out with the criticism that literature lacks logic. It is counterfactual with all the traditional variations of literary and all the theories that criticism that we are trying to evolve the cognitive methodologies and readings, and we cannot overlook the scientific and the logical. However irrational literature is, however imaginary literature is, we cannot undermine the scientific value of the facts hidden inside every literary piece of work. And here it is not only about what we think, it is about how we think. We always have this relative value and logical reasoning, right? Relational value is more important than the content value. I hope all of you know this difference, that content value, in science, it is content. In language, it is relativity. We don't have any solid content, any specific content to be delivered. It is all fancy. It is all, intuitionary. Content is counterfactual in literature, but it has a relative value which is incomparable. I'm just trying to say that, the beauty of literature is all these writers write about all their, experiences, and they are allowing us to discover the space that every literary work gives the reader to interpret. So we are intended to look at things in terms of the other. I'm sure that all of us would have experienced this relational value of things, right? Especially that is like, have you noticed our patterns of conversations when we talk to people with whoever it is? We usually communicate in a way that when somebody uses something or talks about something, we relate it to something else. We relate that, yeah, some similar incident happened some years ago. We always talk about something as if something similar, right? Something similar happened. So we have a way of looking at one thing in terms of another. And in literature, we call it as comparative literature, not only between the text. We connect everything, every thought process between our everyday experiences, not only in the textual, not only the intertextuality that I mean, even the famous artist, the painter Pablo Picasso, he invented the modern art by looking at the primitive art. So there is a way by which we connect. So it is all about the relativity. And there is a change of thought process. It is not about the information, but the information architecture. It is not about the content. It is about the content curation. And the network, the knowledge. No knowledge exists in isolation today. Everything is networked. Everything is interconnected. So we deliberately think through our mental voices. I'm just trying to reiterate the cognitive conversations. What I mean is we are thinking through our mind. We control our mind by our language. In that way, we cannot deny the fact that our reasoning and our rationality is in our imagination. I'm repeating that. It may be contradictory. Our reasoning and our rationality is deeply rooted in our imagination. Einstein had said once, major breakthroughs of his physics have actually taken place when he was trained with the violin lessons in his childhood. So I'm just trying to say that literature is not just a practice. It is a cognitive agency. It has a neurological base. It is cognitive. As much as it is communicative, it is also cognitive. Moving ahead, next slide. Yes. So calling your attention to this learning culture. Today, the shift from knowledge to finding the most appropriate knowledge, right? Needless to say, the amount of knowledge production that we indulge is. So today we really don't have to construct knowledge. It is everything about association and the relevance. And we live in an era of information explosion where everything is data. So the data is just floating around us. The information is just floating around us. We have the multiple version of the same thing. Nothing is singular. Especially in literature, no text exists in isolation, right? So everything has a binary. Everything has exists in multitudes. We only have to choose. So knowing what to choose is as important as knowing what not to choose. So I would say that knowledge is also knowing, from the construction to the association and understanding the relevance of something. Even if we are not clear about what to choose, maybe we need to know what not to choose. So this is the perspective shifting that has actually taken place. And in the practices of literature, all the characters, events, and sequence of word, it all becomes experimental. It all become application oriented today. So experimentation in literature has become an unavoidable thing. Literature is no longer a singular specialization, as I already said. Today, we have scholars who are working with the Darwin's theory on Victorian novels. T.S. Eliot's narratives are looked at from the clinical psychology. Cognitive psychologists are decoding the works of T.S. Eliot, and literary topology in Yeats and Frost, where scholars are working with the geocriticism, the landscapes. I have one of my scholars who is working with Delhi as a subject, Delhi, because Delhi is a city which has a lot of history revealed and hidden. So she has chosen Delhi as the subject of her research. So I'm just trying to say that even geography has become an aspect of discussion in literature. So literary and all the behavioral interventions, even interventions are conducted to the cancer patients. We had scholars who actually worked on that, conducting literary therapies to the cancer patients, and a lot more dimensions are heading into literature. So we cannot undermine the value of literature in attaining the non-literary outcomes. Literature is no longer literary. It has a non-literary base. It has a cognitive base. So amidst all the literary theories, the literary theories we painstakingly by heart for the sake of examination or for writing the thesis. All the thematic variables that we discuss about a text, there is an aesthetic cognitive continuum. Aesthetic cognitive continuity. We know we don't read, we read for the sake of reading, but we also read because we wanted to get some information derived, right? We have both instrumental and experiential way of reading a text. We consciously and unconsciously read sometimes, and when we read literature, we read because for the sake of experiencing the reading. So consciously and unconsciously, we need to be balanced. As I pointed out, networked knowledge, it is propagated by Einstein. He says that no knowledge exists in isolation. It is all connected. It is all interconnected. So I'm just trying to say that literature, however antique it is, however ancient it has shared meanings. Every knowledge has a way of meeting the past and the future. Every text that we read has a way of connecting us to the past and also giving us a scope of looking into the future. We not only personalize literature with our emotions. We do it, of course, we associate a lot of emotions to the literature, the literary works we read. But the emotions that we connect to a text last only for some time, right? It doesn't last longer, only for a length of time. And when we give a rereading to the same text in another time, it will change. So we emotionalize, we romanticize literature, but when it comes to a serious reading, we also have to rationalize our emotions. We have to be logical. More than anything, we have to be logical. Yes. Moving ahead. Next slide. So could you please change the slide, please? Yes. And as the question is, how do we rationalize all these literatures we read when we know that it is fiction, it is fancy, it is unreal, right? It is all unreal portrayals. It doesn't, there is no truth in the text we read. They are all the characters of distortion. What is the scope of logic? What is the space of logical inquiry in all these unreal portrayals? Because they are the characters, they are the stories of distortion, as I've already told you. We know that they don't exist. They exist in the minds of the author. And when we do a serious reading or a research, we need to be systematic and precise. Because I've told you already in the beginning that literature is a critic, right? We deal with literature as a critic. We don't read with literature as an entity of emotion or experience. We deal with literature because we are all basically, academicians, and we have to deal with it more critically. So when we know that, all these things is a fancy, it exists in the mind of the author, and there is nothing, true about it. And you know that, in research or in a serious reading of a text, we cannot be fluctuating and fluid. We need to prove our argument. We need to state the hypothesis. When we write a research paper, of course, hypothesis and the objectives will be the thing that, everybody will be looking at. So we know that at the heart of every creative reading, we have a desire to arrive at a logic. At the heart of every text, all the poems and all the Shakespearean plays and all the fiction, all the dramas, all the narratives, it is settling a conflict. Of course, it is settling a conflict, and writers write it out of their personal quest. All these literatures are not written because the writers wanted to construct knowledge. They have written it because they wanted to get rid of their emotional outburst. So it is created for another purpose, but we need to read it for a different purpose. So intellect is not a danger to creativity and literature. We usually associate intellect as a harmful thing. It is destructive. Intellect is never destructive. Logic is never a destructive factor to literature. Subjectivity or creativity should not be a defense mechanism to skip the efforts of proving our logic. I repeat, our subjectivity shouldn't be, or creativity. The creativity is an umbrella term. You can speak anything and everything. But that shouldn't be a defense mechanism for not taking the efforts to prove your logic. Knowledge hierarchy. There is a knowledge hierarchy in academia. Language and literary studies are considered to be the coolest disciplines because they say, it is all cool emotions. And sciences, contemporary sciences have very elated status. Applied disciplines, they are all considered to be, much stronger, much intellectual, much logical than where we are placed. We all of us know this dissociation between the language, literature, and the humanities and the sciences, which is already, which always exist. So how much can we spend time thinking and talking about all the characters and not applying our logic? We cannot undermine our logic, right? Our logic cannot really be undermined. We will have to derive at a logic at the end of every creative reading. And how can we do that? Let's move ahead. Next slide. So despite of all the literary affordances and the cognitive experiments that have taken place, the thought experiments I've told you, this was a challenge. There was the anti-cognitivist challenge from the time of Palmer to Hume's to Simon Blackburn's, the linguist, who had come up with the idea of quasi-realism. And there were so many non-cognitivists, right? They were all questioning the faculty and the logicality of language. As Sir mentioned today morning in the languaging, the duality of language, the factuality and the fictional, right? The factual imaginings of literature is actually challenged. The semantic, they call it, this is a nice, way of putting it, the semantic non-factualism. Look at that. They say it, they state it as the semantic non-factualism. This, of course, the session which today morning he delivered to us was actually a challenge. The questions were serious and the insights definitely have to be addressed. So this semantic non-factualism, every meaning changes with every new reading. Every time we read a text, the meaning changes. And where is the, it is not static, it is arbitrary, it is super fluid. So where is the space of interpretation when every time we give a new reading, when the meanings change, how can we interpret a text? And according to all the non-cognitivist or the anti-cognitivist, these prepositions of literature, they infer that literature is nothing but a jewelry, like how we wear jewelry. It's an ornament. It can never be an instrument. So artistic and literary truth, the artistic and the literary truth are not scientific. That is the claim of cognitivist, anti-cognitivist. According to them, literature is only a faithful expression of world and truth. It can never be realistic. It can only be an expression of the world and truth. It can never be the truth. And if you really take up all this challenge and understand the process of our literary readings and our aesthetic engagements, we go through multiple phases of experience in the process of reading. So let's discuss, what really we experience when we read a literary work of art. Yes, next slide, sir. Yes. So we know that we have a taxonomy of theories. We have sprawling theories, right? A lot of theories, which is already discussed in literary criticism. Of course, we need all this. But I used to tell my research scholars that the theories that cannot be the text. The theories are not the text. The theories are the tools, and the tools can never be the text. Most of the time, there is only a thin line of difference between the theory and the text. We interpret theory as a text, and in all the research thesis, we'll say that one whole chapter is devoted to theory, where people never write about it or return to after they write the rest of the chapters. It will be just isolated. It will be there. Conceptual framework or a theoretical framework will be definitely one chapter hanging, which doesn't have any connection to the rest of the chapters. So the way we try to decode a text, of course, the theories are very important. I don't have any disagreement with that. The theories have, it has a legacy. It is legitimate. It is credible. But the literary interpretations are so vast. As I already told you, when we try to make a meaning of the text will expand in its own ways, and the meanings that we already attribute will just go. It just branches out. So how are we going to deal with this process? Because we have hundreds of theories around us. We have hundreds of way of looking at a text. And when we choose one way, leaving the 99 aside, we cannot just say that I have chosen it because I like it. You cannot just say that, it is a gut. It is definitely needs a reason. When we have 100 ways of looking at a text, and when we choose that one way of looking at it, we definitely have to prove our logic. It is worth proving the logic. So out of 100 texts, 100 perspectives, when we look at that one perspective, I'm again telling you that we really cannot be diplomatic about language and literature. Because language, and I've already told you, it has become a way of deception that, everything and anything and everything can be hidden and covered behind language. So this is the byproduct. Of course, it is the byproduct of human emotions. And there is an outburst of real pain. How people have written all this text. It is, it has a lot of emotional outburst. It is the aftermath of their pain, pleasure, every relative emotions. It has a repository of emotions. But when we interpret a text, we need to be true to ourselves as much as we need to be true to the text. So how do we find this balance? An interpretation, which is personally my favorite, but if I apply it into the text, it may affect the instrumental or the institutionalized way of reading a text. How can we find a balance between this aesthetic and the cognitive, the continuity? How could it be established? So that is the question. So I would say that whenever we read a text, I'm just trying to consolidate the lapses that we experience when we read a text. So a lot of critical to rationalize a text, but it all starts with the intentions. Intention, it's a beautiful word. Intention. Intentions of the author and the readers. The meanings, the meanings of a text flows from the intentions of the people, from the author and the reader. So we definitely have to, as language communities, because words and expressions are secondary. Basically, it has a human emotion, it has an intention, and we need to decode that intention before we decode the language. So if you look at Coleridge's Dejection and Ode, a beautiful poetry where he wrote at the juncture of his heartbreak. He never wrote it because he wanted us to read that poem. Coleridge or Wordsworth, Shelley, Byron, whoever, they have not written it knowing that we will be reading it today. They have not meant it for the construction of knowledge. They wrote it because they wanted to feel happy. They wanted to get rid of what they felt that moment, right? It had an intention. So intention cannot be overlooked by the fate, or sometimes we say that it is incidental, it is cosmic, it is a miracle. Nothing. Literature is not a miracle. Literature, of course, even the wildest literatures, even the most miraculous literatures basically have an intention. So the intention cannot be overlooked by the cosmic reality or the spiritual or the miracle or whatsoever it is. And we have to look at how the meanings crept into the text. We need to look at the intention of the author as much as the intention of the reader. So establishing an intention, establishing this intent, postulating an intent is very crucial in the interpretation of text. No matter how advanced readers we are, we can read text in multiple ways, but at some point we have to realize that the text not only belongs to us, it also belongs to the author. So we have to give that shared space to the author. There may be two or more people involved. It is not only author. The author would have written about that subject which deals with the other people. So definitely we will have to connect, map all these people. So somewhere amidst all these multiple meanings that exist, we need to map the intent. We need to look at the intent. We attend to the words of the text. Our mind travels through all the imageries, metaphors, symbols, structures. All of us know that. We give an attention to all this. That comes to our awareness, right? We remember the things that we have already read. When we read a text, we remember the past. We have a way of connecting to our memory, to the long-term and the short-term memory. So every time we read a text, we activate the memory. We derive the connection that it has with the past. And sometimes when we read a text, we may remember a music, or we may remember a painting, which is entirely a different genre, or maybe a portrait, or whatever, right? Or maybe we remember another book. So it is important to pay attention to this process where what actually captures our mind when we read all these words, all the utterances. And once we access it and we give, words, we understand these words, it is like a cue, right? We are looking at all the past references, and when we recognize, that is the next point, the next stage, act of recognition. It gives us information, recognizing that we have already understood the intention and we have accessed the meaning, and the recognition gives the information that is stored in the memory, because everything that we connect to our memory, there will be an emotion and there will be some sort of information, right? It may be a car drive, but we may remember a car accident. So I'm just trying to say that it may be, it actually, the meanings interchange in the memory. So sometimes we remember good memories when we read bad memories. Bad literature. It all can actually change. That is why it is also scattered, and we need to go through this process. We may remember a friend or a movie or anything. There are many things by cross references by which we connect. So I'm just saying that this is a dangerous lapse, because we cannot get carried away by the emotions. Some people, when they read a text, they become very emotional. They close down the text, everything. The reading is over there. It is a chain reaction. We have to access the complex memory structure, right? We have all the complex structures inside our brain, and both pain and pleasure of the past. As Aristotle and Plato, they have regarded that, this emotional axis is a central part of the aesthetic experience. Every time we read a text, of course, we will have to deal with it emotionally as well. So it is okay to pass through this emotional meanings of the text. Definitely, it is important. It is not a bad thing. I'm not saying that emotions are a bad thing, but we should not just carried away by them. It is best erased by not talking about them. Sometimes we will have to be silent, not revealing too much about what we feel about a text. And the fourth phase is, the information processing, where, as I already told you, the chain reaction, that when we read something, it activates our memory. We remember all the past things, and we remember part of information, partly emotional, and the emotions fade off, and we recollect the information to value of a content. We remember it as an information. When the emotions fade, we get into the informational value of it, and we may recollect a relative information, something that is informative about the text. So through our reading and listening and writing of literature, this actually takes place. The stage where we deliberately take efforts to make meanings, and intertwining our emotions with information is a beautiful thing. There is nothing powerful than that. You can be emotional, but the way, we blend it with the information that we know about a text, the way we feel about an intention, the content, and the emotion that we feel towards the text, it is all hidden in the work of art. And the writers have done it all deliberately because they wanted us to discover this. So we need both emotional and the informative processing in the cognition. Emotion is a thought. Emotion cannot be undermined, but we also have to deal with it informationally. And at the point, we cannot ignore the ambiguity, which is deliberate. I've told you, the authors wanted interesting characters. If the characters are flat and if the characters are predictable, the author creates, nobody is going to read them if the characters are predictable. The author creates multiple meanings to divert our attention from what he really means it. So it is not to drain the meaning, but the moment of such lapse will give us better clarity. So it makes us think deeper and better. If everything is said and done, we don't have to look into it because he is giving ambiguity, a bit of ambiguity and space to interpret. We hunt it down, right? We think deeper about it. And the next important thing is context. How long can we write an essay just because we have a memory, we have emotions, and we have information? We cannot. We cannot review a text just with the emotion and the information. We have to be contextualized. Sometimes it works that we can write about the text by the information and the memory that we access, but most of the times we have to place it in the context. Our interpretation of every literary work is partly from the memory and partly contextual. These days there is a hesitation to talk about the text because we don't want to talk about anything outside the text. Teachers, especially literature teachers, their pursuit is textual. That we are so textual. The literature is only meant to be for literary analysis. Literature is not any other thing. I would say that literature is anything and everything that is other than literature. When I say context here, it is the people around us. It is the life the people live. It means the time, the space where it is read, the time where it is read. It means the society, the individuals who are seeking answers in the society, the individuals who are unhappy in the society. We need to map them, we need to connect them, and we need to interpret the text, understanding the lives that they live. The surrounding elements of the reader are so important. That is why I meant context. The immediate meanings of a text, right? The surrounding, the meanings that we make derive from the surrounding, our culture. Whether it gives an answer or not, we definitely have to contextualize every literary reading. We cannot say that it is textual, it is emotional, it has a part of information. No, we definitely have to contextualize and identify a pedagogy that can help us to understand the literature better. So I would say that we should have a thought of applied literature. In psychology, they have come out with this branch of study called applied psychology, where their discipline, their knowledge could be applied. We will also have to think about a point of time in our discipline. We will call it as applied literature, application of literature, just like application of psychology. Somewhere amidst, I'm just trying to say that amidst all this individual memory, the information we retrieved, and the social context, the meanings are derived, meanings are created. Moving ahead, next slide. Next slide, yes. In academia, creating a democratic form of knowledge is the biggest challenge today, because we have a discipline. I've told you that, in not only in our discipline, in other disciplines of the knowledge hierarchies, the knowledge patterns or thinking, which will be convincing both to intuition and logic, which was both intuitive and which is both rational. We will have to intersect both. I've already told you, it is, as Albert Einstein said, it is a combinational force. We will have to intersect ideas beyond our logic. Say that beyond the sciences and aesthetics. So it is a combinatorial force, and the ability of a person to connect and intersect ideas from the associations, the ideas that seem to be different at the first glance, the ideas that seem to be unrelated at the first glance, but of course it is complementary. Scientists are creative, and I've already told you, Newton to Einstein to Steve Jobs, they say that imagination is essential to create new meanings and connections. So both creativity and critical mind are important in the meaning making process. And when we deal with a discipline which is very ancient, which is very antique, and which is very sensitive, like language and literature. Next slide. Yes. So if we really, try to map the dimensions of every literary analysis, we always end up with this. We usually take either the textual perspective or the author's perspective, the writer's wisdom, or the reader's perspective. We never, we always have a tendency to take either one of this. And most of the times there will be an overlapping, that push and pull between the text, the author's perspective, the reader's perspective, everything will actually be overlapping, and there will be, this, confrontation between all the many perspectives. I would say that we always have a tendency to accept the similarities and reject the differences. We don't want, anything different. That we always wanted the similarities. How far, text similar to the author's perspective and the reader's perspective. I would say that we have to accept the differences. Of course, we can justify the similarities, and we have to accept the differences of the reading, reassert the differences, and start thinking about them. Next slide. Yes. So as I already told you, when we trace to the origin of the meanings in a text, the inferences are drawn in the integration, in this intersection. I would say that it's a hybrid approach where we need to have a mind which is not emotional, which is not only rational, which is hybrid, which is accepting both emotions and processing the information and adopting a pedagogy. When I say pedagogy, a methodology to derive a social context. So we need to have an emotional value, an informative value, and definitely a content or a contextual value. And sometimes we need to do this process, engage in this process where we verify and cross-verify between the fact and fiction. It is a beautiful process that, shuttling between the fact and the fiction. As literarians, we also have a responsibility of social cognition. We cannot say literature is all fancy, it is the imagination. Read it to ourselves and close down the book. We cannot do that. Though we have a range of idiosyncrasies and all the aesthetic, characters who are very weird, super weird, definitely, it impacts a social cognition. So there is this line of difference between our everyday thinking and our fictional thinking. Somewhere in between, we have to find a balance, the emotion, intellect, and the information processing and the pedagogy. It will all together serve thinking and social, cognition. Moving ahead, I'm not detailing much because we are running short of time. I have few important slides to cover. End of the session. Yes, next slide. Yes. So these are some of the case studies. When I say cases, I'm presenting it as a case for my discussion. These are the research studies, PG, MPhil, and PhD research works undertaken in the Department of English. Some of the scholars who are, they are still pursuing, and some of the scholars are here, I guess. So I just thought, I'll be able to present you the schema of their work so that it will help to understand how this pattern could actually be derived, the emotional value, the content value, and the informative value. So this is a work which is done by a PG student. She worked on the theory of law of attraction. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the theory of law of attraction by Abraham Hicks, which talks about the thoughts and things. He says that the thoughts become things. And she had made a comparison between the elements of law of attraction from Paulo Coelho's Alchemist, a very famous allegorical novel. And of course, the Alchemist is written to universalize the very idea of law of attraction. Paulo Coelho advanced professed, which is a very profound work, and it also has a parallel of the theory of law of attraction. And interestingly, she has also worked on the counter intentions, right? The conscious and the subconscious. It says that counter intentions can actually harm the intentions. So subconscious can actually the safest place. Conscious can actually harm the intention. So the power of subconscious over the conscious. And she proved it with, she had taken it, extended it with a couple of interviews, sampling that she has done amidst psychologists, cognitive experts, literarians. She got opinions from them, the experts, and also she conducted case studies among the classmates who are actually using these techniques of law of attraction, the cognitive reframing. There are so many techniques like visualizing, scripting, affirmations, thinking only what we want to think and thinking not what we don't want. So there is this, practical way of application of the theory, and she had looked into it and come out with an amalgamation of all the three: the theory, the text, and the real life examples and the data that she collected from all these people, it came out to be a beautiful work. Yes, moving ahead, next slide. Yes, so this is also another PG project. This girl was actually, there when I was in Bangalore in Christ University. She worked on this G Tiles Narcopolis. It is a very famous work. It is actually, the plot is set in underbelly of Mumbai. The central character is Dimple, and Dimple is a hijra. Dimple is a transgender, and when she actually went through this text, she was unwilling to believe the text as a whole, because she could no way connect to the hardships or the realities of a transgender, because we know that always the transgenders have a very sad stories. They have, bitter experiences to reveal. So she was unwilling to believe the text as a whole. She was questioning the credibility of the text, though it is fictional. And she told that she definitely wanted to undertake a field work with a couple of transgender. And she had actually worked with a transgender organization, conducted a lot of interviews and case studies. And I still remember that after she has gone through the practical experiences, the real life experiences of the transgenders, that her case was Ambika. Ambika was a mechanical engineering dropout. She had a very, bad experiences in her life, because she was a man trapped in a woman. I mean, a woman trapped in a man. She wanted to pursue her gender, that she wanted to, her desire was to be a woman. And, about the society and all the harsh realities, that she was not able to do that. She was thrown away from her college. She had to discontinue her studies. Her family, her relatives, everybody had desolated her. And she had a very, terrible life ahead. So this was the main case. And the scholar was trying to derive the connection between Dimple and Ambika, and found out that Dimple doesn't exist. I still remember after the interaction we had with the transgenders, when we were returning, this scholar told me, ma'am, Dimple doesn't exist. It is all about Ambika. So she was trying to make a connection between, she had taken the queer theory and understand the reference and the cross references between the fact and the fiction, the real life incidents, and plotting it all with the theory. Next slide. Yes. And this is a research work which has taken place in the Department of English, supervised by Dr. P. Nagaraj. He was a Chinese scholar. His Chinese name was Cheng Desheng, and his Indian name was Kuberan. One of the professors have given him this name Kuberan because he was so fond of money. If you ask him what you want to become, he says he wants to be a rich man. So he was baptized with this name, Indian name Kuberan. And the title of the thesis came out so beautifully, that it is Cheng Desheng to Kuberan, an autoethnographic study on intercultural English language learning beyond classroom. This is actually autoethnography. It is a method, autobiography and the ethnography put together. This is the method of research in ELT. It is actually where the subject becomes, the self of the researcher becomes the subject of the research. Could you please move on to the next slide? I'll continue with that. Next slide. Yes. So here the researcher's self is interacting with the real life experiences, and the researcher has to research about himself. He becomes the subject of the research. And here the process and the product, the experiences of the researcher. So this scholar, he came from China, and when he initially reached here, he was unable to speak even a single word in English. He was not able to interact with any of us. I'm sure that even Muthukrishnan sir would be remembering him. And later, we all were astonished, wonderstruck when he did a Viva Voce examination, because his language had tremendously improved. And his research work turned out to be his own experience of this intercultural language learning, how amidst the two cultures, shuttling between the two cultures, he could acquire a lot of language. So his own experiences become the focus of the research investigation. And he had researched about his own life experiences. There were educational theories, ELT theories. He integrated everything and come out with a beautiful work. Yes, next slide. Yes, this is another research, a PG project, from pottery to poetry, a study on sensory synergetic perception. This is actually the pursuit of beauty is she says that the pursuit of beauty, it is interconnected to the pleasures of all the senses. She calls this process as synesthesia. She worked on the exchange between the visual and the textual aesthetics. So she had this bunch of ekphrasis poetry which is inspired from the paintings. So it is actually a visual art, the rhetoric turning into visual. I mean, the visuals turning into rhetoric. And the idea of, it is literally the idea of translation of colors to words. So this girl actually she has chosen a couple of, next slide, chosen a couple of paintings, poetry, which is actually inspired from paintings. And she was trying to understand one art in the reflection of the other. So she was understanding the rhetorical element using the artistic perspectives. So here she had also applied this theory called sensory synesthesia. It's a neurological phenomena, synesthesia, where it is actually propagated by this German physician, and he says that it is that we always have a response. We always respond to one art through the other. So ekphrastic poetry is one art in response to the other art. So she had understood the theory of synesthesia, applied it to the portraits, the paintings, and the poetry, and derived the analysis. Yes, next slide. This was another study, an interesting study by one of my MPhil scholars. Yes, it is about tattooing. And tattooing is the interaction process. She calls it as an interaction. Ideas, so she had actually taken the ideas from the scientist, the Ukrainian scientist, where it talks about the socio-cultural personality. It is there where they understand a human being as a biological entity and a bearer of consciousness and culture. So externalization and internalization of human values and beliefs were decoded in this work. Next slide. So what the scholar has actually done, she has taken a literature which is called Electric Michelangelo, a book where the main characters are tattoo artists, and there is also this tattoo, the subject, the client, who is a woman who is getting tattoo done every time she gets hurt. So for her, it is a psychological, it is a defense mechanism that every time she is hurt, she goes to the tattoo studio and gets the tattoo done. So this scholar had actually worked on the psychological and the cognitive perspectives. And she had also conducted a couple of case studies interviewing the tattoo clients and the artists. So she amalgamated her real life interactions, her theory. She had adopted the psychological theories and the text Electric Michelangelo, and blended into the analysis. Next slide. I'll wrap it up, just 2 more slides. And this is actually a work where the scholar had worked on the theory of Historia Forti, which is about a visual narrative. This is a book. Mary Coyne is a book which is evolved by inspiring from a photograph. So a book turned out into a perspective which turned out into a book from the photograph. And this is about a woman. This photograph is of a woman, a migrant woman, who is looking at a distance with her infants, with the children on her lap. So the journalist was trying to capture this depression and the plight of the migrant people, and come out with this photograph. It had turned out to be an award-winning photograph, and the author wanted to convert the entire experience into a novel. So when a photograph is turning into a rhetoric, when the visual is turning into a rhetoric, it is altogether a different perspective. So she had actually adopted a theory which is called Historia Forti by Rosenstone's theory, and where the representation of history and thoughts into visual images. So she has done discourse analysis, she has done the analysis of the photograph, and she had done a theoretical analysis, and she blended it all. Yes, next slide. So to give the parting thoughts, I suggest that it's high time that we have to start thinking about literature as other things, that we definitely need to break our textual obsessions. And maybe we need to have synthesized a neurobiological model of literature where I've told you from our atoms and molecules to the aesthetic. Even our body has to react to the way we read. The body definitely has, I don't know how many of you know about this professor, and she is an author, Sumana Roy. She has written about a book, How to Become a Tree, where she talks about the syntactic and the semantic spaces in our body, where she believes that every emotion, every utterance has a biological source. So we have to synthesize the other perspectives into literature. Literature should not be read just as a text. That definitely we have to seek evidences in the longing of rhetoric. We long for rhetoric, we long for words. We look for the next word, next sentence, next page, next idea. But literature is not fancy. It is the association of the ideas and the meanings, right? And we need to, I've already told you, we need to have a hybrid mind. We cannot be very emotional. People will pull you down. You also have to be logical, and you cannot be super logical. You also have to balance both. So words have a space in the unknown. Words have a space, right? You know, the words which are which we really have not realized, which is yet to be spoken, and also with the words which are familiar. So maybe we will have to think about all this, the intentions, the ideas that come from the external sources. And chasing human literature, we have a lot of people around us, and their stories have a lot of value more than what we read in the text. So we definitely have to pursue the ironies and the paradoxes of such people, understanding them, identifying their life experiences, and connecting it to the text we read. It will definitely give us a better meaning. And extending the literary reading to the real life practices. I'm just trying to reiterate that literature is no longer literary. It is non-literary. It has a lot of non-literary outcomes. It has become a tool of social empowerment today. Language is not only to speak, it is not only to read, write, and interact. So possibilities of applied literature, literature is not a trivial pursuit. We cannot undermine the logic, the value of literature. It has a science. It has even the loftiest, even the wildest literature have a logic which is severe than science. We have to synthesize it all, break the textual obsession, and understand it in a way that we have never understood it before. Next slide. So allow me to end with this final quotation from Lewis. He had put it in the work, an experiment in criticism with his thoughts. Let's wind up with his thoughts. Literary experience heals the wound without undermining the privilege of individuality. There are mass emotions which heal the wound, but they destroy the privilege. In them, our separate selves are pooled and we sink back into the sub-individuality. But in reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do. I'm sure that all of you would have had some takeaways from all this, and let's wrap it up. If you have any questions, let's get into the discussion.
Thank you, Ashita ma'am, for the wonderful session. The presentation shows the effort that you have taken for us. Ma'am, we have a couple of questions in the chat box. Our moderator, Dr. Sumitra, will read the question, ma'am.
Yes.
Sumitra ma'am. Sumitra ma'am. Okay, no issues. Ma'am,